Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Brian Staveley for his book, The Empire's Ruin, in conversation with Arkady Martine. Quick note before we begin, live captions have been enabled for this event, and if you would like to view the captions, you can find the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom window, or if your screen is a little too small to see the whole thing, there's a little ... more option, and if you click there, you'll be able to see it. The transcripts are automatically generated, so sometimes they aren't 100% accurate, but they are, they're pretty good most of the time. So I'm just gonna drop all of that information into the chat for you now, in case you need it. So, all right. My name is Alex Abraham, and I am a bookseller at Brookline Booksmith, which is located in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is the first time you're hearing about us, welcome. End of sentence. We're very happy to have you all join our community this evening, and we really appreciate your support of the authors and their books and your local independent bookstore. The chat and question box are open, so please feel free to make use of those. And I'm so sorry if you can hear my dog barking. He's upset about something. Please remember to set your chat to all panelists and attendees if you would like to chat with other people in the audience. And please try to drop your questions in the Q&A box rather than just in the regular chat, so they don't get lost in case the conversation gets exciting. Please
just in case.
Oh, yeah. Please also note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can and will be removed from an event for such behavior. However, I know we're all here to have a very fun genre fiction time, and none of you would dream of doing such a thing. So really quickly, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our moderator this evening. Arkady Martine is a speculative fiction writer, and under the name Dr. Anna Linden Weller is a historian of the Byzantine Empire and a city planner, which is a very cool resume. Under both names, she writes about border politics, narratives, and rhetoric, risk communication, and the edges of the world. She is currently a policy advisor for the New Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, where she works on climate change mitigation, energy grid modernization, and resiliency planning, which, again, coolest resume ever. Her debut novel, A Memory Called Empire, won the Hugo Award last year for Best Novel, which is amazing. So everybody do their Zoom applause. And then we have the author of the hour, who we are here to celebrate tonight. Brian Staveley has taught literature, religion, history, and philosophy, all subjects that influence his writing, and holds an MA in creative writing from Boston University, where I also got my undergrad, so kudos. Yeah. He works as an editor for, I'm gonna not say this right, Anti-Lever Press.
Anti-Lever, yeah.
Anti-Lever Press, and has published poetry and essays both in print and online. He lives on a long dirt road in rural Vermont, where he divides his time between running trails, splitting wood, writing, and urchin wrangling, which I assume affectionately refers to his children, but who knows?
That's correct. Yeah. I have one 9-year-old son.
Oh, that's amazing. I have a 9-year-old sister, so they'd probably get along great.
It's a super fun age, yeah.
Yeah, it is. All right, and of course, the book we're here to talk about tonight. So Brian first shared his journey through the, these are names I've never said out loud, so please forgive me, the Enduring Empire with us in The Emperor's Blaze a few years back, and The Empire's Ruin is the 5th book in that world. It picks up a few years after the original trilogy's end, where we find the empire disintegrating, the ranks of the Kettrel decimated, and this new godlike race is beginning to stir. So it's very exciting, very new, very different. If you haven't picked up a copy yet, please do. It's a beautiful book, and it's also like, it's just, I love big doorstopper fantasy books. So this is great. So it is such a pleasure to hear them both speak tonight. Please join me in welcoming Brian Staveley and Arkady Martine.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, this is awesome.
Having us, yeah. And we're going to talk over each other. This is the peril of Zoom.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, I want to first apologize for not having read the new book yet, because I'm incredibly excited.
1 day old. It's only 1 day old.
Yeah, well, your publicist was very kind to me, and but it's really exciting, especially because I'm really fascinated by the choice you made to return to this world and then to take it apart, to like unpick all the scenes.
Yeah.
And
I think that's a thing, right? Like, the first trilogy that I wrote has a certain arc, both for the world and for the characters. And So sorry if you can hear. I'm in like the eye of a hurricane right now. If I'm hit by lightning, I love you all. Yeah, or if this just goes kaput, that's what's going on in the background. But yeah, the first trilogy, like any story, has an arc. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, both for the overarching plot and for the characters themselves. And one of the challenges of coming back to the world is that, the end of a story is a kind of resting point, right? If you're working with a piece of music, you probably are returning to the tonic after all kinds of melodic explorations. And with a story, you come to a kind of resting spot. And then if you want to keep telling the story, you need to break that rest, right? Mm-hmm. And so that actually, when I say it like that, it sounds obvious and like I should have understood this from the get-go. I did not. So initially I had these characters and I was like, these are characters that I love, that some readers love, and I've got them in a nice place. Let's just keep going with that, which was absolutely the wrong instinct and a really pretty backwards instinct. And what I realized I need to do is I need to take this whole thing that I've built and just huck it at the ground and shatter it, so that then new stories arise. Yeah, both for the characters and for the world.
What's interesting to me is that you seem to be thinking about moving the characters from a place of rest.
Sure.
But the characters, partially because of who they are and who you build them to be, their lack of rest creates a lack of rest in the world itself.
Mm-hmm.
And also you have to raise the stakes, and they were pretty high in the first trilogy. So sure. How did you feel about, I guess, taking apart a structure you had built in the world building?
I mean, once I got around to it, I felt really good about it, because there's a dynamism to it. So I have some questions for you. I just started reading a memory called Empire, right? That's the
Yes.
Yeah, I just started reading it, and so we both have Empire in the titles of our books, and we both have empires in our books. And so I have some questions about that in a minute. But yeah, the danger of an empire or an imperial system is that it reaches a kind of stasis, and stasis is the antithesis of storytelling, right? And so yeah, once I realized that I needed to start breaking it, and once the book is called The Empire's Ruin, and that's actually a pretty exciting point to be writing from, right?
It is. It's one that we avoided, which is why I'm so interested in why you find it exciting. But then I think I approach Empire in a more dynamic than static way, or
Sure.
Anyway, the Empire I'm writing about in the Tixkalan books is pretty much at the height of its powers. So
right. Yeah.
If it's gonna fall, which it very well may, it's gonna be sometime in the future.
Right.
Like outside the range of the lifetimes of my protagonists.
Right. So I was going to ask, one of the questions I had about your Empire, because it's obviously I've only read 2 chapters, but it's obviously extremely well imagined. And that just hits you right up front, that this is like, you have done your work in building it. How did it all go down for you in terms of characters versus world building? Did you say, first I'm going to flesh out an entire empire and then I will populate it? Or did you have these characters that you wanted to put in some kind of conflict and you made an empire for them to be in tension with?
Well, I sort of cheated, because I spent 10 years of my life as an academic, and I'd studied Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire.
Sure.
So I kind of had an empire in my back pocket.
Yeah.
And I mean, Tixkalan is not Byzantium for many, many reasons, the most obvious being that they're in space. But they're also, it's hybridized with ideas I got from the Aztec Empire, from the Mongols, from America, lots of things. So I didn't concentrate on the empire as a world building task, because I had pretty good instincts from the work I'd been doing in a different field.
Yeah. It's so valuable, right? Like, I mean, I taught world history and world religion, and I lean on that all the time,
every day.
Constantly, right? And it's just, I actually think one of the interesting struggles when when you're leaning on real world analogs is to make sure that you're complicating them adequately, and not just, I sometimes have to resist, the opportunity to just pull whole cloth from the history of our Earth, which is so rich and interesting. How do you handle that? Like,
I think
you're like this
a lot.
Yeah.
But because I was a medievalist, so my source material doesn't have a certain kind of depth that you need for a story in a modern novel, like the emotional or characterization depth that you'd expect in a story, that I'd want in a story. Right. So when I steal a plot or a scenario, the people in it are often very much stock types, because that's how they get written down for very good reasons in a chronicle history. Being that the person writing the chronicle history wants to remember events in a very particular way, which usually has a ethnic or national or religious reason behind it. But those people aren't super deep.
Right.
And when you make them into actual people, when you build characters around a concept, they automatically shift away from the strict beat by beat accounting of what happened in history, because when you add things to that stock trope, you're adding motivations and conflicts that lead you away from the initial impetus, at least for me.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's the conversation between the characters in their world is, ever unfolding. And I'm always delighted by the way that one little, deviation in the path, which in the moment seems trivial, can end up dictating a whole, plot arc, or even a whole book, or even the whole series, right? It's just, these little things, one bump in the road and you're on a different path entirely. I think it's always kind of
What's your favorite one of those that has ever happened to you in writing? The tiny diversion that you didn't realize was going to be huge.
This is one of many dozens or scores of examples, but in The Emperor's Blades, my first book, I had a character, an assassin, a priest of the god of death, who was a pretty minor character in the book. Plays a hinge role in one event, but is not doesn't have a lot of screen time. And my editor at the time, a guy named Marco Palmieri, great editor, he said,
I know Marco. Marco's cool.
Yeah, right. He's an awesome guy. He was like, why does this character have to be a guy? And I said, no, that's actually a good idea. So I changed the gender of the character, and that character became like one of my favorite characters to write, became kind of a fan favorite character, to the point where I wrote a whole standalone novel about her. It's her whole own novel. And that was all just because of this one editorial note about like this book is kind of dude heavy. Why are you doing that? Like, what's going on here? And I was like, yeah, it's fair. And then it spawned this whole thing. And I feel like I have this whole relationship with her now. And, all these readers have this relationship with this character who was almost, I think, on the way to be a pretty dull, boring character. But instead became, this thing.
Sometimes when you have to hone in on a person you've made up, when you want to change like one thing, like a gender, or which is of course is one thing that has a lot of effects.
Sure.
And you get to figure out what the chain of consequences from making that one change is. And in the process of doing that, you end up, like you said, really weirdly close to the character, because you spent all of this time rethinking them.
Yeah.
They're no longer just there for use. They're there because they're part of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I find that like they, your characters resist you. I feel like they resist me sometimes. I always used to think this was bullshit. You would hear people like, authors talking about their characters and like, well, I just follow them where they go. And I was like, that's, I think Nabokov has something. It's like, that's crap. My characters go where I tell them because I'm the author. And I'm sympathetic to that because of course, yeah, you're the author. But it is interesting to me the degree to which a character that you've been writing for 2, 3, 4 books can come to really resist your impulses about where you want a book to go. Do you experience that?
I do. I've only written 2 novels. So I have not yet got back weight
Mhm.
behind everyone.
Yeah.
But in plotting some of what I want to do in Tixkalan 3, which is like 2 books away, and like the stuff I'm doing, I have a completely non-Tixkalan book I'm working on now.
Yeah.
But I thinking about some of the characters and some of the sort of obvious choices that I could make with them, and the sensation of just getting a hard no, like, not interested.
Yeah.
That's not the story.
Right.
I think it has to do with building something that's sufficiently complex that it becomes somewhat subconscious to you, author. That the character starts not having a life of its own, because that is kind of bullshit, but having a sufficiently complicated set of characteristics that you know what feels correct and what doesn't, no matter what you, the author, want.
Yeah. There. You know, in my third book, so the last book of my first trilogy, there's this, you know, I have a character who's kind of a special forces soldier, like a, you know, fantasy Navy SEAL, basically.
Yeah.
And I had an idea about where he was headed. And it was a, you know, kind of a redemptive plot arc with, you know, standard redemptive plot arc. He makes some mistakes, has some troubles in the middle, comes back in the end, right? But the mistakes that I wrote for him in the middle and the things that he did in the middle were dark enough and bad enough that whenever I tried to write him into a redemption, and I tried a lot for many months, it just didn't work. It was like I had this idea about where he should go, but it wouldn't happen. I mean, I would write chapter after chapter after chapter and be like, this is horseshit. This is nonsense. This doesn't make any sense. This is wrong. And I have another character who is a colleague of his. She's also one of these special forces soldiers. And in the end, it's not as simple as me giving his plotline to her, because it's, you know, she has her own plotline. But in that first trilogy, a lot of the redemptive stuff that I thought was going to happen for him ends up happening for her. And he has a scene where he sees her, you know, middle towards the end of the third book, where he looks at her, he's like, she stole my life. Like, that's the life that I was supposed to have. She's living it. And that's a thing that he feels as a character embedded in his own world. But it was a thing that I felt as the writer for those characters, that's
great.
I thought I could bring him back. And no, like, he had done things in book 2 that I was like, okay, but now let's move on. And it was like, no, you don't move on. You do not move on. So that's, yeah, that was a good object lesson that they don't go always where I want them to go.
There was a character I had to split into 2 people at one point.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, well, it was, and fairly late in the process of writing Memory.
Yeah.
I will not, no, I could tell you the names of the characters who used to be one character, and then you'll be amused because you haven't read them yet. So there's 2 counselors on LaSalle Station, which is my protagonist's home. Yeah. And one of them's named Petroska Daj. Oh, no, sorry, damn it. Daj Taratz. Petroska Daj is a real life person who existed in Byzantium, who I sort of based the guy on. But Daj Taratz and Aknel Amnadvat, who are very different people now, but in the draft I sold, were one character. And my editor, Davy Pillai, who's just absolutely annoyingly brilliant, was like, well, his motivations kind of contradict each other. And I was like, oh dear.
Yeah.
Oops.
Yeah.
I needed someone to do all of the things for all of the reasons that I had put in, but I could not build a coherent internal life for a person who would do all of those things for all of those reasons.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Needing to be 2 people, and then I'm really glad that happened because it made writing the second book a lot easier.
Yeah, I mean, I have never had that particular issue, but I relate to the idea of having to make that kind of structural change, right? You have things that need to happen in a plot and in a story and in an arc. And one of the things that I do, which I think is related to it, is I have this habit of writing the same scene twice, over and over and over, or I'll write the same character twice. I sort of do the opposite of what you're describing.
Oh, interesting.
I have this redundancy built in. It's like, I really need a certain kind of person in this book but then I kind of don't like, I don't know what's happening in the dark recesses of my brain, but I don't like the way I did it the first time or something, so I do it again. And I have some readers who
two of them.
well, I don't know. I have some beta readers who are really smart, and they're like, you can have one of these characters or the other, but you don't need both of them. They're fulfilling exactly the same role functionally in the story. And the same thing with certain scenes where it's like, do you need both of these moments of catharsis? Probably not. Maybe you just need one of them, but you can't choose. And so you're having this weird double catharsis where the second one doesn't land because the first one already
did. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So I have this habit of like doubling up on everything, which is a different problem from the problem you're describing, but I think at root the same.
Yeah, I think the difference might be, I suspect you overwrite and edit down.
Yeah, in some ways, yes. Yeah.
And I underwrite and have to add after the book is over. For memory, I added 40,000 words.
How long is memory overall?
135.
Yeah. So you added,
they're not nearly as long as yours.
No, but the point is, it's 50. I was just asking because it's 50% longer. You added a ton.
About a third, between a third and a half. Yeah. And the arc of the story is exactly the same. There's just like an entire other book in there shoved in the interstices. And I did a little better on the second book. I only added like 18,000 words to Desolation in edits.
So do you notice that there's a certain kind of thing that you skip or you miss in the first pass, like a certain type of thing you need to add?
I don't explain enough. I just skip right over things that I know.
Yeah.
And that I assume I've put in.
Yeah.
And then my beta readers or my editor or my agent will read it and be like, but why did that happen?
Yeah.
And I'll be like, but because of these 18 things that I didn't write down. I'll be right back.
Yeah. I mean, a thing that I struggle with, especially at like, I'm like writing the 6th book now. I'm like really tired of writing fight scenes, like oddly specific, but I'm super interested in the emotional and psychological state of people before they're going into a fight. And when they've come out of the fight, when they've either, they faced their own death, maybe they've caused a death, all that. I'm interested in all that. But the kung fu-ness of the fight itself, I find myself skipping over all of those. And, again, I have beta readers who are like, you need to put in the fight. Like, I've been waiting for 300 pages to see these two people fight each other. This is a fantasy novel, asshole. Can we have the awesome, it can't just be like Richard III of him, in his tent before the battle,
and then
the battle's all
wandering through
over.
the ruins of everything, like trying to get himself a horse.
Yeah. It's like, that's not satisfying. They're like, we want some, okay, cool. All the psychological stuff, great, necessary. It's a thing you're clearly interested in, but, and I always almost have to go back. And if the fight doesn't exist at all, I have to write it. And if the fight is 3 paragraphs, I need to make it, 2 pages. And it's a struggle for me. I mean, I don't know. Those scenes I'm so much more interested in the emotional state of the characters than the mechanics of, who is where.
I have a lot of trouble writing fight scenes at all. I think if you don't count the space battles, which are different because they're like with ships.
Sure. But
that I find easier to write.
Yeah.
I guess because I think really spatially, like as a person. So like thinking in a 3-dimensional battlefield space, if you're looking at it from like the bridge of a flagship, that I can write.
Yeah.
Because it's all a bunch of moving pictures, basically.
Yeah.
But I think there are literally 2 fight scenes in A Memory Called Empire.
Yeah.
2 fight scenes and 1 person and building combat in which a building falls on people, which doesn't really count.
Yeah. What do you think? I've not written science fiction. I haven't written space operas, these big space battles. It seems to me, having thought about it for the last 18 seconds, that there would be some real similarities, though, in writing a fight scene, because the 3-dimensional reasoning you're talking about, that's alive in two characters who are grappling. It's just, you know, it's more intimate and sweaty, but I don't know.
Keep track of people's limbs.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
you can kind of reduce a spacecraft down to a single point if you have to.
I see. That's interesting.
And also you can make it rotate in ways that don't matter with gravity.
Mm-hmm.
My wife, who is my first reader for everything and is way better at combat than me, and writes it much better than I do, had to remind me that if I had a character lunge for another character's legs, they would not automatically be standing up on the other side of the roll.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that.
Yeah.
And maybe it's just that I personally have done very little like one-on-one physical competition.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most of the sports I've done have been solo things like swimming.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, a few years back, I went through a little phase where I was going to this Brazilian jiu-jitsu place. I was awful at it. Like I never, all I did was just like get choked out every day. But it was super useful. It was super useful for writing, because even though I was horrible at it, I was thinking in terms of, you know, all those questions. Where are the limbs? What are the things that your character is thinking about or worried about or focused on when they're fighting in this kind of way? And I hadn't done anything like that before. You know, I wasn't a wrestler, I wasn't a boxer. And I think it proved valuable. I mean, I lean on that when I'm writing certain types of scene. Yeah, it was, I should probably do it more. Maybe I'd enjoy writing the fight scenes more. But then the danger is, of course, you don't want to write fight scenes that are just for, you know, MMA fans, like, because that's going to be just so utterly dull to anybody who's not like immersed, you know, in that world.
You don't want it to be a technical description.
Right.
You don't want to write choreography that could be reproduced.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. One of the things that I have done a lot in my life that I am decent at is rock climbing. And I've had rock climbing scenes in my books from time to time. And it's amazing to me how uninterested I am in describing them. Like, and I've tried to like make it feel exciting the way a climb feels exciting to a climber. And those have all been just utter failures. I mean, I just scrap all that stuff.
It would be weird. I've done a very little bit of rock climbing and I love it. I need to get back into it. I've never done it outside. I've only done it on walls inside.
Yeah.
But there was a time about 5 years ago, I was sort of decent. And I don't know how you'd write that kind of evolving physical intellectual puzzle.
Yes.
How you'd write that.
Yeah. Well, because you have to couple it. You have good climbing near you, by the way. But you know, out in Los Alamos, there's all kinds of excellent stuff. But anyway, like, you know, coming back to what we were saying, like you have to kind of couple it with the emotional content. And like a thing, you know, if a group of climbers are hanging around, they're discussing a climb, it's interesting to describe it in a certain way, right? Like you're going to hit the gas stone, you're going to have to shift your weight, right? You're going to get this mono, you're going to do this other thing. Nobody who's reading a fantasy novel wants that. They want a totally different thing than what people who are actually interested in that sport want.
Yeah.
And that's always that. I find myself doing more of the wrong thing and then be like, nope, nobody cares. Nobody cares about that climb. They care about, oh, is this character like terrified of heights? What are the consequences of failure here? Are they going to just die? Are they going to fail somebody else, which is even worse than dying? That's what's all going to be interesting in my story, right?
The best book I have read that described climbing was nonfiction, called The Tower, which is about this really ridiculous climb in Argentina. And the guy who said he sent it the first time, and people think he's lying, and trying to prove that he did take the route he said he took.
Yeah.
And it's not technical in the way you're describing, like the and here's the handhold, and then lift your right foot above your left hip, etc. But it's emotionally technical. Like here is the part where you'd have to do this complicated series of moves.
Sure.
And that is psychologically hard because of this. Can this guy do it? And that part was fun to read.
Oh, it's cool. I'm going to read it. It's called The Tower?
It's called The Tower.
Interesting.
I actually think I might have, I just moved house. I might have unpacked it. Yes, it's by Kelly Cordes, spelled Cordes.
Okay. Yeah, I'll
Yeah, I think you'd like it.
I like all of the the armchair climbing, armchair mountaineering books. I'm into all of those. But again, like exactly like you said, they come back to these questions that are not just purely mechanical. It's and yet I think that I think readers want a degree of the mechanical. I don't mean that in a negative. I mean that in a value neutral way. But like they want to know what your spaceship is doing. Like, is it doing an awesome move? Is it rotate? They want to know how physical bodies in contact are in relation to each other. So, yeah, I always think that's an interesting dance and a fun challenge to find what's at the heart. There's all this stuff going on, right? All flashes and bangs and this and that. And this is a place where I think sometimes movies fall down because it's so easy to just put more flashes, more bangs, and they're not forced to get at the heart of what is in a scene. In books, flashes and bangs just aren't that as impressive. I could just write, and then a thing blew up, and then another thing blew up, and this was a very large explosion, right? People don't give a shit. So you're forced to find your way into something that
you have to find a way of creating the same level of impact that film and television can create very easily with a visual signal.
Yeah. It's so interesting to me the way that there are things, every art form has its strengths and its limitations. And there are things that are so easy to do, so effective and in film and television. But one of my delights that I've discovered in writing books that film and television you could maybe do, but it's much more difficult, is that because people don't know who they're looking at, you can do a lot of interesting sleight of hand and misdirection. So in the book that I'm writing now, which follows the Empire's Ruin, there's a character from the Empire's Ruin. She was a very villainous character. People will not like her, and they shouldn't. She's a bad person. But in the beginning of this book, she becomes a POV character, and she's a prisoner, and she's taken on a new name to hide herself. And that's just the name that I serve up to the readers. I'm like, here you go. So none of the readers know who she is, just because I've changed her name, because she's changed her own name. And then, 2 chapters in, you'll find out, oh, this is that character. But my hope is that by that point, the readers will have a new impression of her, maybe a slightly more favorable impression. And you couldn't do that with the character on screen, because as soon as the character walks on screen, people are going to be like, oh, there's so-and-so. I mean, you can put them in a hood or something dopey like that, but it's
sure, you can do some really complicated tricks, but it's not a native.
It's not native
form of storytelling in a visual media.
Yeah.
You could do tricks with having multiple actors play the same person.
Yeah.
And I've seen that done really well, but only in science fiction.
Yeah. Well, and there's, this is maybe this is a little embarrassing. It's the second time I've used this trick, but it makes me happy every time. In the first trilogy, there's a main character, a POV character. His name's, I'll leave it out. But, and I had this chapter in the third book where it's this character comes in. It's the opening chapter for that character. And readers are always really confused. They're like, what is this character? Why is he up there? Why is he doing this? And it turns out it's not that character at all, but somebody who's named for him. This character is named for this other character.
That's nice.
And I had such a fun time with that chapter. And it felt like you said, I love your word. It felt like a native trick to writing, that just writing, it's a gift that working in this kind of form gives you the opportunity to do something like that. And I liked it enough that I'm doing it again. So
with different valence. I mean, what you're describing for the book you're reading now is a character not only tricking themselves and their world, but also in a sense the audience.
Yes, absolutely. No, it is in service of a different goal. That's absolutely true. It's just, it's always exciting to me. You know, I feel like sometimes I feel a little bit envious of movies and television, because you can have an orchestral score, and you can have, you know, special and all these things. And then I remember that literature and writing has also so many delights.
There's so many tricks that,
Well, so many tricks
that film does not. Most of the internal psychological work that you can do is really difficult to do well in film. Not impossible.
Yes.
There's some amazing films that do that, but it's a hell of a lot easier in prose.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to remember. Like I said, I just read the first chapter this morning, first chapter and a half. But A Memory Called Empire, is it third person limited, or are you getting in a bunch of heads?
It's third person. The first book is third person limited with a couple of interludes that have other points of view.
Okay, yeah,
but it's like 95% from the one protagonist.
Right.
Third person limited. Well, it's a spy novel in its deepest sense. Yeah. So it's an information control novel. So if would have been a very different book had I added more points of view.
Sure.
The second book has 4. And in that way they're all in third limited mostly. Okay, the second book has 5, and the 5th one is first person plural limited. I like playing weird point of view tricks.
Yeah.
It's spoken as we.
Yeah. How did you come to that?
I needed some really alien aliens.
Oh yeah. Oh, awesome. I love aliens. I hate aliens that are like people, but they're wearing a different costume.
Yeah.
I hope that's not your aliens.
How alien humans can find other humans. Actual aliens.
Yeah.
Oh, that's going to be weird.
Do you have in the whole corpus of science fiction, do you have any aliens either on screen or in books that you find particularly satisfying, or like just really you're into them? They're like, that's it, that's cool alien.
Yeah, I kind of, let's see. I love the aliens in Mieville's embassy town, but that's mostly because I love the ridiculousness of the question that those aliens ask by their existence, which is like, can you have communication without deception? I'm a really theme-oriented writer and reader, I guess. In terms of aliens that just, I like them because they are great aliens, the Atevi in C.J. Cherryh's Foreigner novels.
Oh, I haven't read them.
They're great. People who like my stuff tend to like those because she's a huge influence on my writing. Those aliens, they have a society, they have technology, they have structures that look like they might be like human relationships, but they're not.
That's cool.
They're really not. They have completely other motivations, and the misunderstandings that the human characters have in figuring out why the alien characters do what they're doing. So they think they understand, because it looks like, oh, these people are loyal to each other because they're family. And that's not what's going on at all. They might be family, but that has nothing to do with
all kinds of feints, feints and misdirection.
Yeah.
That's cool.
I think the aliens I like are all about like psychology, like how different and how do motivations work.
Have you read Blind Sight by Peter Watts?
Oh my God, yes.
That's my favorite alien book.
Oh, you know, that it might be mine if it wasn't so goddamn depressing.
Yeah, it's dark. He's dark.
I read Blind Sight in a post-Soviet hotel in Budapest, and that was both correct and a horrible idea.
Yeah, that's, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm sort of on the one hand applauding, and on the other hand, I'm like, oh.
I didn't know at the time. I just took with me to a conference.
Yeah. I'm not even sure I fully understood the end of that book, and I've read it like half a dozen times.
Did you read Echopraxia?
I did. Yeah.
That one was weirder.
I liked it a little less, but I admired it in the way that I admire. I always admire what he's doing, even
it's brilliant, even when I disagree with it.
Yeah, sometimes I'm like, it doesn't hit for me, but like that's some wild stuff that's going on. Yeah, interesting. But I'm always a little disappointed when the aliens show up and they're like, they also have sarcasm, and they also, I'm like, come on. They're like pair bonding. They just like, come on. Aliens.
The structures that aren't pair bonding. You can do all sorts of things.
Yes.
Do herds, do
right.
large, like large carnivore pride structures.
Yes. Yeah.
Do, I don't know, termites.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Those are interesting. Termites. Try termites. They build stuff.
Yeah. What do they call those? I'm forgetting the name, but those, those animals that they're often insects that, they work in those,
hive-mindy things. And there's a word for it, and I totally have forgotten.
I'm blanking on what it is now. Yeah. So like in The Empire's Ruin, and actually in the first trilogy too, there's kind of this ancient race, humanoid, but they look very human, like beautiful, godlike, powerful humans. But in writing them, I've turned a lot to sort of the animal world and thinking about how they are, socially isn't even really the right word, because social, I think, is kind of a word that applies to humans. And although they look like us, they are not us. And so looking, when you mentioned prides, I mean, I've been thinking specifically about lions and did like a whole deep dive into like, well, what's up with lions anyway? Like,
it's fascinating. I did that.
Amazing, right?
The really alien aliens in Desolation started with, I don't want to do something that anyone else has ever done, so I need something that people don't usually make aliens out of. So I went for hyenas to start with, and then added some other things.
Cool. Oh, that's awesome. I'm just excited that these books are, if they're ahead of me. So, like, that feeling when you find a new book that clicks in the first chapter. I was like, I'm at a friend's house now with some of my friends, and I was like, everybody just get this book. We're gonna read it. We're gonna like it. We're gonna talk about it. Yeah. It's interesting, in fantasy, obviously we don't have alien. I mean, some fantasy does have aliens.
Do though.
It's out there. But you have, in like the Tolkien-esque fantasy, you have the elves and the dwarves and this and that, and they get their own little characteristics. And it's interesting to try and take some of those tropes that exist and have a long, hoary lineage in the genre, and not just to chuck them out, but to try to do a little something different with them.
Yeah.
Like, I have immortal beings in my books, in a way like Tolkien's elves, but they're not elves, and they trying to think through the consequences of what it is like to be immortal, truly immortal, and what effect that has psychologically on an organism. That like is a really fun exercise, and like one that actually really helped to power the whole first trilogy and the conflict of the first trilogy.
Well, it would, because it creates a psychological hook.
Yeah.
And a way in, but also some really strange things, sufficiently weird, which I think is genre fiction in general. You get to be sufficiently weird to get really deep into some of the ideas of human psychology, of imperial structures, of ideology, of religion, of whatever you are really interested in. But you can do it from a place that's sufficiently weird that you can dig your fingers into it and sort of like pull it apart. That was a bit grim.
No, but it's totally right. It's like a little laboratory where you can just get to work on these ideas and a lot of these real world concepts that I used to teach about, teaching religion, for instance. It's like fun to work in a world of fantasy religion and to make it messy and to make it confusing in the way that I think a lot of real world religion is confusing. There's a character in the first trilogy, and everybody thinks she's a prophet. She thinks she might be a prophet, but she's not sure, right? She's not even sure if she believes in the goddess that she might be a prophet of. On certain days, she's like, yes, the goddess exists, the goddess is on my side, the goddess is speaking to me. And on bad days, she's like, maybe I'm just losing my mind. And I don't know. And
that's probably the experience that people we think of as saints and prophets have.
right? Yeah. I mean, you're reading Augustine or anybody, you know, you read those
I'm
folks. And
thinking of Joan of Arc mostly.
sure,
because
yeah,
that's
absolutely, yeah.
one that I always am amazed at the psychological strength she must have had to hold on to her own self-belief and her faith.
It's astounding. And I mean, you know, she has those moments at the end, which I think are very human, where she sort of recants and then she unrecants.
Yeah.
Love that.
It's
I
great.
love that, right? Where it's like, if she would be a less interesting character to me if she had been absolutely steadfast and just said, no doubts, let's do it. Come on, let's go ahead and burn it. She was like scared.
Yeah, because she was a person.
Yeah, she reminds
Whether
me.
or not she was also like speaking to angels.
It's like, I love the scene in the Iliad when Hector faces Achilles and then turns and runs away.
Yes.
Right? It's that's for me, that like that moment for Hector and that moment for Joan are similar moments. And then what makes them like heroic to me and just amazing characters is that after crumbling, they somehow pull it back together, right?
And try again.
And rediscover their conviction. And the rediscovery of conviction is so much more interesting to me than just steadfast conviction that's just there and never wavers.
Doubt's far more interesting because that's something that people can identify with. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think for most of us, though, you know, if I was Hector and I turned and ran, I was just going to keep running. You know, I would not, you know, and he does for a while, right? I forget how many times he runs around Troy. It's
a bit,
right? But he stops, you know, and Joan of Arc, she's like, no, I don't want to burn. I don't want this. And then they're like, well, you're going to go to prison. She's like, no, let's do it. Yeah. It's like totally amazing. Both of them are like, just, those are great moments in world literature, world history.
They really are.
Yeah.
We've got some questions that we should do before we run out of time.
Yeah, sure. So here's a question. What was most different about writing this book versus the others? So The Empire's Ruin is my fifth book. I wrote a trilogy, I wrote a standalone. And when I started writing fantasy, I had, just ideas about things in the genre that I was excited to play with, to tackle. And in the course of the first trilogy, I felt like I was able to do a lot of the things I wanted to do. I wanted to write certain types of scenes. I wanted to explore certain types of characters. I wanted to make up my own pantheons and religions. I wanted to make up my own magic system. You know, it's always all the fun stuff. And it's always character driven. The characters are always front and center. But there are these structural things, these technical things that were exciting to me. In the new book, it was much more raw. You know, I 5 books in, I wasn't like still doing that stuff. Like I have a whole new continent, and I had to come up with like a history of why this continent is poisoned, and you know how it got so poisoned, and what, you know, all this stuff. So that's all there, but it's just the characters. They were the ones that dragged me into the 5th book, and in a way that I don't think was quite true of my first book. One was just like, let's get to it with some really tough emotional and psychological stuff. So in The Empire's Ruin, it opens with the Special Forces soldier. She's the one, coming back to the beginning of our conversation, who got the happy life that the other guy was supposed to have. And then in the first chapter of this book, you know, she's on a mission, and she makes some bad mistakes, and a lot of people that she loved dies. They die. And so then just like working with the character, and this like kind of reflects a little bit on Joan and a little bit on Hector, who's like broken and who has made mistakes and is like really dealing with the ramifications of grave errors. That's what drove at least that whole plot line of this book. And, you know, she's on a quest to the far side of the world, and there are monsters, and there's a like abandoned city with mysterious architecture that nobody understands, and there's ancient artifacts, and all that good, fun stuff. But at the heart of it is like this character, like who has lost herself and needs, like, as a matter of life and death, to find herself again. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know how that squares with where you are with any of the stuff that you're working on.
I could have stopped at the end of Memory. It has a very clear close. And writing Desolation after it was, in some ways, allowing all of the consequences to actually happen, as opposed to like the longer term ones, because the big question of Memory gets resolved by the end of Memory. Otherwise, it would be a very good book.
Yeah.
And so does one of the big emotional arcs for my protagonist. But the choice that closes that emotional arc for her creates a series of cascading consequences, which are then part of what I'm exploring in the second book, along with the geopolitical consequences of how she solved the other problem. So, and the two things do dovetail together. One of the, I guess, for me, the book I'm working on right now is not in the same universe. And it's the first book I've written not in that universe.
Yeah.
So it's really hard and really different.
Sure.
So that's where I am with that. Just like, also I'm writing like nearer future science fiction, where you can recognize things that used to be places like Los Angeles. And that's an entirely different process.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I mean, I'm still making stuff up, like a lot, but I'm also, there has to be a different kind of logic chain. Like, can you imagine this being how LA would be in 400 years?
Yeah, I was gonna ask, so it's about 400 years in our future?
About 400, yeah. Little wishy-washy on the exact date.
I think whenever I am able to avoid, I sometimes go through my drafts and I edit out specific numbers when at all possible, instead of being like 6 years since this or 8 years since that or 12.
I should do that.
I just say
I would have fewer continuity errors.
I know I'm going to get something wrong, and somebody's going to be like, "Oh, it was 8 years," and I'm like, "Oh."
In not copy edits, but page proofs for Desolation. So the book is typeset.
Yeah.
I have read it through and checked off the typeset bits, and the proofreader comes back and is like, "So it takes another month for them to get there. You lost a month."
Yeah.
I mean, I fixed it, but oh my God.
Yeah. I love maps. I love cartography. Like in my own life, I like to do a lot of the sport called adventure racing, where you go try and find stuff in the woods based on, map maps. My agent, who I love, Hannah Bowman, she's like brilliant and incredibly talented, and I trust her in everything. But maybe her one weakness in life is that she's not interested in maps. And so we'll have scenes where she's like, "Brian, it's taken an awful long time to get from here to there." And I'm like, but
it takes that long.
It does say it's 1,000 miles. And she's like, "Well, how do you know?" I'm like, it's there. You have the map, Hannah." She's like, I don't look at the map. But I mean, if she watches this, she'll know that I'm just needling her, because this is like an ongoing thing with us. But I like the map, because the map to me is like, Robert Frost said that like writing free verse is like playing tennis without a net, which, is wrong, but I think it has some interesting.
Wrong but useful.
And I sometimes think of a map that you create at the beginning of a fantasy trilogy without having written all the books is the net, or is one of the nets that you have to play over. It is a thing that gives structure and challenge to the task at hand. And I'm always going back to the map, and the map is always confounding me, but those obstacles become the opportunities that force me to do things that I wouldn't, my background is in poetry and writing poetry. And, Keats has this idea, John Keats, romantic poet, has this idea of negative capability, and, not just doing the thing that you are trying to do, but finding in yourself the thing that you're not trying to do. And I find form, you know, in poetry, poetic form, but there's all kinds of form, right? There's musical form, and the map is a
There's
kind of
story
form.
structure form too.
Story structure form,
I
absolutely.
use a lot. It's like one of the, I mean, you say you come from poetry. I come from short stories. Like that was my first
Yeah.
format, and the one I still feel the most comfortable in a certain way.
Sure.
And being a short story writer, at least for me, because I like to play around. I like to do creative and strange things with short stories.
Yeah.
I learned a lot of structure and a lot of structure tricks and ways of organizing information and other ways of following a plot aside from linearly.
Sure. Yeah.
And that has both served me very well in writing novels. And I think that's probably why I have to keep adding 40,000 words to my books, because they're like a bunch of short stories shoved together in a box, and then like, look, I made you a thing. There's no breathing space in the thing. No.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, but do you find that the structures that you're grappling with have a way of forcing you outside of yourself or deeper into yourself, forcing you to some place that you did not anticipate going?
Absolutely. I think formalism in general does that.
Yes.
And that's one of its primary uses. Not the only one, but one of them.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think the map, you know, I think maps are like that for me. So I like having the map there, and it's like, oh, I have to get from here to there. Okay, they're problems for me as a writer, but they're also opportunities that would have gone unexplored otherwise. Yeah, like we were looking at some of the questions here. Do you have a favorite character across your books or in this new book? I mean, you know, Gwenna, who is this character who exists. She's the Special Forces soldier. She exists, and she's a very minor character in the first book that I ever wrote, and she just kind of becomes more and more important, and almost autobiographical in only like emotional ways in the most recent book. Yeah, she's the thing for me right now. But one of the things that I find delightful, I'm curious to hear how you feel about this. I love writing secondary characters, non-POV characters. I find them so easy to write compared to the POV characters, because the reader does so much of the work for you. And so you need to give them an awesome voice, an interesting voice, a voice that's recognizable and compelling, and some traits, right? That's all pretty easy to do. And then the reader will fill in the blanks in, I think, really rewarding ways. So I have a bunch of of secondary characters in this new book that I loved writing, in part because they are secondary characters and they are able to just be either horrible or absolutely remarkable and exciting, or just comic relief, depending on the type of character, and you can just kind of leave it there I find that the things that fans respond to, things readers respond to, people are always asking for, hey, can we get a book about this secondary character, that secondary character, the other one?
Sometimes I find myself doing that. Like, I could write a whole book about that guy. In one scene to move my protagonist from place A to place B on his supply ship. But so this is one of my favorite, like, I did it by accident and then it turned out cool. There's a bunch, because it's a military science fiction novel in sort of, kind of. There's many different ranks that people have, and I had mixed up two of them. Like myself, I had forgotten which one was which. So I had assigned the wrong one. I had assigned the title for people who have the in-world version of a doctorate to this guy who is piloting a supply ship headed out to the military frontier. And then in rereading, like, I came back to it like 2 days later, having taken a day off. I was like, oh, wait, I should what if I don't fix that? What if I leave him there?
Totally.
And he still doesn't do anything else but move people from place to place. But at some point in that guy's life, he decided he was going to write a doctoral thesis. And he did. and now he is piloting a military supply ship. And I
Yeah.
want to know about him. I don't know very much about him, but I bet I could go find out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what, my fourth book was called Skullsworn. It's a standalone. It's exactly that. I had this priestess of the god of death. This is the person who I was talking about earlier. And everybody was like, can we just get like a whole book about her? And I thought, yeah. And then you realize, or then I realized how much of the work I hadn't done in writing the original trilogy. Yeah. She was there, and I think she's an effective character. People love her. People wanted more of her. But that was a relatively easy lift in the original trilogy. And then I wrote Skullsworn in first person, and discovering that voice was like a whole...
Oh, first person is hard.
Oh, a whole different challenge. I mean, I loved it.
I love it too, but it is, for me, aside from when you're writing like in the film noir voice, which I find very easy.
Yeah.
But all other first person is incredibly difficult.
Yeah. Well, it comes with this built-in challenge of, well, there's several built-in challenges. One, I think it's necessary to figure out what is the context in which the story is being told, right? That this person is speaking to whom and from what remove from the events being described.
I mean, first person allows you to do a whole bunch of stuff with unreliability that third you have to work a lot harder at.
Yes. And just the tension between, a first person narrator, like the voice, let's say your person is narrating events at age 40 that happened to them at age 20. You get to build this tension between the 20-year-old's voice as depicted in the events as they're occurring, and the 40-year-old's voice, which is the narrative voice of the story. And exploiting that tension becomes one of the delights of, I think, writing in first person. But
absolutely.
Anyway, I see we have Alex back online. Hey, Alex, sorry.
Hi. I'm so sorry.
We're just drifting at this point.
Interrupt the comment. No, it was great. I was like, I can give him 2 more minutes. Like looking at the clock. Yeah, well, thank you guys so much. I'm so sorry to everyone who had a question that we didn't have time to get to. I was kind of peeking around. The audience was definitely like very, very invested. And so was I. I was like, oh man, I don't know. So yeah, thank you both so much. And thank you to the audience for coming and asking your questions. Arkady, thank you for moderating. Yeah, and I'm going to just actually, before we go, drop that link again in case you still haven't picked up The Empire's Ruin. You can totally still get one from the Eventbrite page, and I'm linking it right there. You can also get a memory called Empire from the Brookline Booksmith store. We've got a staff rec on that right now. I think one of my coworkers really enjoyed it. So yes, we love science fiction and fantasy. We have a huge section at the store. It's always fun to do these kinds of events. And it's always so sad to see them end. But Brian and Arkady, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Of course, yeah, no, anytime, come back. All right, good night, everyone. Thank you.